And now, my son, go thy way. Declare the word with truth and soberness, that thou mayest bring souls unto repentance, that the great plan of mercy may have claim upon them.
Welcome to the podcast, Truth and Soberness, declaring the word through Come Follow Me. Your hosts for this show are Jason Hunter and Jeff Hicks.
Welcome, everyone. We're happy you're with us again for this next episode of Truth and Soberness. We've missed a few days, and so we're going to discuss Jacob for just a few moments, and then segue right into the great story of Joseph. And so we'll turn the mic right over to Jason.
Yeah, thanks. Jacob is worthy of a lot of discussion, but I think if we mention just a couple instances here, we can get a really good idea of what's going on, especially if we talk about Jacob's ladder and Jacob wrestling with an angel of the Lord. I think that if we look at some of the imagery there, we can come away with a lot of understanding of what's actually going on here, and maybe find some parallels in our own lives and in our own worship. Tradition has it, he dreamed and he saw a ladder, right? And angels were coming up and down this ladder and everything. The Hebrew term, though, is used only once in the entire Bible to describe what he sees right here. And though we don't know exactly what it is, the traditional rendering of a ladder is unlikely. What is more likely is that it is a ziggurat or a mountain, or in this case, a temple with ramps that go up and down the outside of it. And so, if you and we're gonna liken this into a temple experience. So just getting that out of the way. This is Jacob's endowment session. This is Jacob's temple experience before seeing the face of God. So he's seeing and experiencing a temple with ramps that go up and down. Though we don't have the same imagery in all of our temples, if you're familiar at all with the Salt Lake Temple, before all of this construction began, you'll know that as you begin your endowment session in the creation room and everything, you move up slightly along these ramps or stairs throughout the temple, and you kind of circle the temple while going up each time through each different room as you receive instruction and go through the endowment. And so the same thing is happening here with Jacob. He's starting out at the bottom, but then he's progressing up these ramps as he goes, and is receiving his endowment, as it were. So one thing that we can look at here is that after this all happens, Jacob names the place Bethel, meaning the house of God. We also have the 3 degrees of glory represented in this story. The angels, or quote, true messengers, go down and return and report. That language is explicit there. Jacob makes covenants with the Lord during this time, including a covenant for tithing. And the Lord then promises Jacob specific blessings, which are found in the new and everlasting covenant. So this is very much a temple experience for Jacob, very similar to the one that we experience. And I think that it's interesting that this happens as Jacob is traveling to go meet his wife. So this is all happening before he would enter into a covenant of marriage and be sealed to them. And then we have the part where he wrestles with a man. And this, I chose that as the background for my picture, so anybody watching this can see that. I'll try to describe it for those that are listening. You have Jacob and an angel wrestling, but it's much more Greco-Roman wrestling than what we're used to as traditional wrestling in the United States. So Jacob and this angel are standing, and their arms are kind of on each other's arms and shoulders as they grapple together. So their heads are bent down toward each other, their arms are on each other's shoulders, and they're quote struggling in this wrestling position. In this position, and if you were to picture a veil between each of them, and that they're making this pose through a veil, you'll kind of get the representation that we're used to in our current temple experience. But in this, Jacob is given a new name. And I'll just read these 3 verses. It says, "And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And he said unto him, What is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, Thy name shall no more be called Jacob, but Israel. And Jacob asked him and said, Tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, Wherefore is it that thou dost ask my name? And he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved." So we have Jacob and this angel, this personage, in a wrestling position, or what Bruce Porter would call the sacred embrace. If you want to look up some things by Bruce Porter and the Egyptian endowment, he goes into a lot of detail that's just really enlightening. So Jacob is in this sacred embrace, wrestling with the angel. And while in the embrace, Jacob is asked if he has a name, and he gives it. And then Jacob is given a new name. And then Jacob asks the name of the angel, and the angel asks, for what cause are you asking my name? And he doesn't give the name immediately. But then we assume that name is given while in this embrace, because then Jacob sees the Lord face to face as he's brought into his presence. And so this is a very powerful experience that Jacob has, where he's given this endowment of power and taken into the presence of the Lord right before an exodus through the wilderness, and where he'll find a wife. So this is all very deeply symbolic in this representation.
Jason, I think it's important as we study the Old Testament, especially from the context of the 21st century, and understand, and I guess I'm speaking from the perspective of a Latter-day Saint who understands the temple endowment, that we can find some things like this story that kind of go along with and represent some of the same things we're familiar with in our temple endowment. And I think that it's important to point those things out and understand that perhaps we can discuss these things on the same plane, and realize that what we understand and what was going on in the time of Jacob, perhaps there's some parallels that we should find important.
Yeah, though their lives were vastly different from ours, there are some things that remain the same throughout time. Then it's these symbolic experiences that stay the same, because they can be retranslated for anyone at any time. You can always find meaning in it, no matter who or where you are. They transcend time, because they are full of imagery rather than full of explicit language or something like that can get lost throughout the time.
Yeah, good point.
One thing I want to point out is that while in this experience, Jacob is given a new name, right? His name is Israel. However, in fact, let me read you again that verse when he's with the angel. It said, Jacob was left alone, and there he wrestled with a man until the breaking of the day. And he said unto him, What is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. Next 2 words. And Jacob asked him and said, Tell me, I pray thee, thy name. We've just been told that Jacob's name is changed to Israel, and the narrative does not represent that. The narrative continues to call him Jacob. And we get that throughout the rest of the Old Testament. It's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We don't refer to him as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. It's really interesting that we have this with him, because when Abram's name was changed to Abraham, immediately you call him Abraham, and there's no more mention of the old name. Same with Sarai turning to Sarah. Everything, as soon as they get a new name, that's it, except in this case. And it's strange that that is the case. We will often see Israel and Jacob mentioned together in the same verse, almost as if there's some kind of a distinction between the two symbolically. And in the book of Isaiah, we especially see this. Often Jacob tries to denote a covenant people before they have fully accepted the covenant, and Israel are those covenant people after having accepted the covenant and become the covenant people. And so you kind of see that distinction, but there are others, and it's worth trying to dig through that and try to come up with why that might be. Why why we acknowledge that his name was changed and yet continue to call him Jacob.
I think it's important too when you're talking about the sons of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. When you go back to Isaac's generation, and realize that there's a couple of branches there that are very important, because we still see those people today in the various definitions and the way that they're described. But it's interesting to me because we talk about so much in our day about Israel and the covenant people and the tribes of Israel and the gathering of Israel and the various lands of inheritance. And it's just fascinating to go back and understand that interesting little tidbit of the name of Jacob and being changed to Israel. However, it remains Jacob in the writing for a large part, and but we refer to it as Israel and the children of Israel, the sons of Israel, the tribes of Israel. And so it's probably a good idea to somehow connect that in our minds so that we get that distinction.
As for the name Israel, in verse 28 of Genesis 32, the angel says, "Not Jacob shall your name hence be said, but Israel, for you have striven with God and men and won out." And so there's this meaning of Israel that he is. There's lots of literal meanings, but one of them is he strives with God. In the name El ending generally makes God the subject, not the object, but this particular verb is a rare one, and there's some question about its meaning, though an educated guess about the original sense might be God will rule, or perhaps God will prevail, or let God prevail, as President Nelson said a few years ago. And so sometimes, there are no punctuation marks in Hebrew. And so sometimes when something is said, you have to wonder, is this a command? Is it a statement? Is it a question? And so this one, God will prevail, how do we understand that? Well, there's this scene in Star Wars where there's Chewbacca is playing a game against R2-D2, and R2 makes a move, and Chewbacca starts getting upset, and C-3PO says, he made a legal move. There's no use getting upset about it. Han Solo speaks up and he says, "Let him have it. It's not wise to upset a Wookiee." And he says, but sir, nobody worries about upsetting a droid. He says, that's because a droid don't pull people's arms out of their sockets when they lose. Wookiees are known to do that. 3PO looks at him and says, I see your point, sir. I suggest a new strategy, R2. Let the Wookiee win. And so I almost see this here with Jacob, because Jacob wrestled with this angel all night and would not let him go. He held him and he kept him and he made himself prevail over this angel, right? So I almost see this new name of Israel as maybe like a reminder or a call to humility, saying, look, Jacob, you're strong and cunning, and you've bested everyone you've gone up against. Here's a nickel's worth of free advice. Let God prevail. Don't be so strong-headed. Don't enforce your own will on things. Let the Wookiee win. In this case, let God prevail. Things will be better. Don't rely so much on your own strength. So I don't know. Is that right? Maybe. Is there something else involved? Who knows? But that's kind of how I see it. It's almost a little bit of a chiding and a little bit of a reminder, saying, yeah, you're pretty tough, Jacob. How about Israel? How about you let God prevail? So
That's
that's kind of
really
how
it.
I see that.
That's a good way to put that, and a lot of personal application for our own good. I don't know how many of us have ever wrestled with an angel, but we can certainly take the message and the teaching from that and apply it in our own lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think with Jacob, we can probably leave it with that and go on to Joseph and talk about um, his experience. In fact, my wife and I were talking about Joseph just this morning. We were talking about some of life's difficulties and how long it can take sometimes to strive through them before we seem to be rewarded. And I brought up Joseph, that despite his insistence on keeping the commandments, despite his fidelity to God, he suffered for decades before he ever saw the fruits of that faithfulness. He was beaten and thrown into a pit by his brothers. He was sold into slavery. He was wrongly accused and thrown into prison for a very long time. And it was one injustice after another thrown at Joseph before he ever came to prominence and came to have the redemption arc of his story that we're aware of. And I think that is certainly applicable to all of us. That if things are tough, if things seem to be going wrong, it is not because we aren't doing what we're supposed to, or that we aren't being faithful. Sometimes we need to be faithful for a very long time before we see the deliverance that we expect should have come much sooner.
I think that's a good point, Jason, especially when we're talking about difficulties in life. And I know that we brought this up before, and it's worth saying it again. We have a tendency, in fact, it's hardwired into us as human beings, to want to sanitize our environment. We want the hard things to be pushed away and be able to have some ease and comfort. And there's nothing wrong with that. However, perhaps our mindset should be, especially when we're praying and asking for assistance in our daily lives, that we should pray for the ability and the fortitude to face our difficulties and challenges and learn from them rather than have them removed. And certainly Joseph is a good story that illustrates that point. As you said, he suffered a lot and sold into slavery essentially, and his brothers didn't like him, so there's some mental problems going on there too if you know your family doesn't like you. And then he goes and gets tossed into a foreign land and mistreated, sent to prison, and that's enough to drive anybody insane. But Joseph endured that and learned from that and rose up and came out of that um, very well. And, we'll discuss that story, but I think that there's certainly a lot of application that we can learn from the story of Joseph.
Absolutely. It all kind of starts when Jacob gives him that coat of many colors. So let's talk about that. In Genesis 37:3, it said, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors." So we have that covenant term "loved" again. Israel loved Joseph. The reason that we're given this is to indicate that they have a covenant relationship, and there's going to be some kind of imagery here with that. And so Israel gives Joseph a very special coat. This is a temple garment, meaning that Joseph now has received his endowment and is living a higher law and keeping temple covenants. His brothers are very jealous about this, because more than that, it was a sign of the family birthright, and that birthright should have gone to the firstborn, but it went to Joseph. And in fact, this in this particular family line, we have a repeated pattern of the birthright not going to the firstborn. Isaac got the birthright over Ishmael. Jacob got it over Esau. Joseph gets it over Reuben. Ephraim gets it over Manasseh. It's a repeating pattern in this family, and probably the cause for a lot of strife as well. But this coat that we're looking for, the word that is used is coutonet, and the definition that comes with that is a tunic or an undergarment, a long shirt-like garment, usually of linen, principal ordinary garment of man and woman, worn next to the person, generally with sleeves coming down to the knees, generally with sleeves and also coming down to the knees, rarely to the ankles. And Hugh Nibley will point out that the language for the many colors is completely off base. There's nothing in that word that would indicate colors at all. In fact, probably a better translation would have been particular marks. And so Jacob is giving Joseph a long shirt-like undergarment with particular marks on it, as he is receiving these covenants and taking on temple type covenants with the Lord. And so we can kind of get a better understanding of what this garment meant to the family. The fact that this was a covenant relationship that Jacob was emphasizing with Joseph. And tradition holds that this particular garment, this coat, was the same garment that was given to Adam in the garden. That this was passed down through the family lineages, and eventually came to Jacob and to Joseph, which added a bigger degree of jealousy among his brothers. When if you have a relic of such importance and of such value being given to the youngest brother instead of the oldest, you can see why there might have been some strife there, that this wasn't just some fancy clothes that Jacob gave to Joseph, but that this was an ancient, famous relic of the priesthood that was handed down and that had not wasted away through the years. In fact, Joseph, when he's beaten and taken by his brothers, they tear his coat in half and take it back to Jacob to say, look, he's been destroyed by wild beasts, and Jacob takes it and holds it and smells it. He can't see anymore, but he feels it and he smells it, and he feels for those particular marks that the coat had. And tradition holds that it maintained the smell of Eden upon it. And so he's trying to smell that familiar scent about it, and realizes that, this is the coat, and Joseph is gone. But we also see through the Book of Mormon that half of that coat remained. It did not waste away, and was passed down through the generations even after that. but that the other half did waste away. And there's a lot of symbolism to be had there between those two halves. But even the one half still supposedly exists in the same form as it did when it was torn from Joseph and recovered by Jacob. But this is a very important piece of clothing, and it was not a simple fancy coat that was handed to him. And so I think we can also try to find some parallels in that story as to how sacred he held that garment, and how jealous his brothers would have been with him receiving this birthright as opposed to them.
That the story of Joseph in what you're talking about with that sacred coat, and the part that Joseph's brothers played in all of this is building up to kind of a point where we're going to see where Joseph has an opportunity for revenge, but he does not take that. But you think about Joseph's brothers and their deceitfulness. They didn't like their brother Joseph. They tore his coat up and sold him off to the slave traders, and told their dad that he was eaten by wild beasts. And you can kind of see the frame of mind. And we're laying a foundation for an interesting plot if you're a journalist or a writer. And it's a great story. So as we continue on here, perhaps as people studying this story, we can consider how we personally would operate if we were Joseph, number one, or if we were one of the brothers. How would we respond and act? And with all of the information given.
Yeah, yeah, good call. And at least they didn't kill him. That turns out to be their saving grace too, because I mean, had they killed him, they would have all died in the famine that was coming up. Um, but it's such a story of redemption, of forgiveness, of covenant keeping and deliverance, and and being exalted from the lowest depths. Joseph goes from being a nobody in prison to being second in command of all of Egypt within a very short period of time. And it shows just how quickly the Lord can work in our lives and work with us if we're willing and able and available when that time comes. I want to talk a little bit about that, about the famine, to kind of set it up. Pharaoh had a dream, and he had a dream, a couple of dreams. One was that there were 7 fat cows, eating on the land and everything and looking fine, and then 7 very thin, almost sickly cows came up and ate the 7 good cows. And he was very perplexed by that. And he had another dream in parallel with that, where he saw 7 ears of corn or wheat, and they were just fat and ripe and looked wonderful. And then all of a sudden, 7 sickly ears grew up and destroyed the 7 good ones. And he really had no idea what that could have meant. Well, it eventually gets to Joseph, and Joseph comes to interpret his dream. And he tells him, he said, this is wonderful. God has given you a huge insight into something, and let me tell you what God has told you. And he said that we are in Egypt here. We are going to have 7 years of absolute plenty. We are going to have more than we can eat, more than we can sell. We're just going to be overflowing. But following those 7 years of plenty, there's going to be 7 years of absolute famine, where nothing will grow and nothing will be available. God is telling you this so that we can prepare in these 7 years of plenty for those 7 years of famine. and then we can, get through this okay. Um, and the interesting thing, and I was reading this in the account that Josephus gives of it, is that after telling Pharaoh the meaning of his dreams, Joseph was then asked what should be done about it. Joseph told Pharaoh, and this is something I had never really caught on to before, but it's very clear in the narrative. Um, Joseph told Pharaoh to force the Egyptians to live within their means. He said anything that would have been spent in excess of their immediate needs should be saved up. Joseph also exhorted Pharaoh to take the corn of the husbandmen and give them back only as much as was sufficient for their food. And then says something very interesting about what Joseph did when Pharaoh made him the overseer of it all. So Joseph says, you know what, we need to live within our means. And as far as like the husbandmen that are out there, they're planting and reaping, we need to confiscate everything that they grow. We'll give them back what they need, but we are going to take everything else. And Pharaoh's like, all right, make it so, Joseph. And so Joseph, having this power given to him by the king, with leave to make use of his seal and to wear purple and to drive in his chariot through all the land of Egypt, they took the corn of the husbandman, allotting as much to everyone as would be sufficient for seed and for food, but without telling anyone why they did it. And it was not common knowledge why Joseph did what he did, nor was the general population informed of the approaching famine. Um, Joseph did not tell the general populace why he was doing what he was doing. He was forcing them to live within their means and then taking, not asking, for all of their grain and only giving back what they needed to survive on. So during these 7 years of absolute plenty, nobody was making a profit during this time. The Pharaoh was taking all of it, but they had enough. And then when trouble came, there was enough not only for them, but for the surrounding countries and their refugees who desperately needed food. And so because of Joseph, there was bread in Egypt. Well, during the famine, Joseph did something else kind of strange. As farmers realized that they had no corn to plant and to grow, they came to Joseph and said, hey, we need some corn. He's like, all right, I'll give you corn to grow and to eat, but I need your land. And so they gave up their land in exchange for corn and food. And then the Pharaoh still took a share of that. And so by the end of this, Pharaoh and Joseph, assumingly, owned all of the farmland because everybody had traded it away for immediate needs of food and planting. And so this was kind of a double-edged sword for all of the farmers in the area. I mean, the government comes in and tells them what to do and how to do it and provides for them, but also makes them trade away all of their autonomy at the same time. I think it's very interesting, though, that Joseph did all of this without explaining himself. And I think that we can take a huge parallel to that with prophets and apostles today. They give us instruction, they give us advice, and they enact different policies and procedures in the church, and they don't always tell us why. And honestly, they shouldn't have to. Sometimes there are things working behind the scenes that we just don't need to know about. And we have to have faith that things are being led and guided as they are. In this case, Joseph was following God's instructions, and I don't know why he didn't tell them what he was doing and why, but they make it a point of showing that he didn't. This was his prerogative, and he enforced it, and there was not going to be any discussion on the matter or anything like that. And sometimes I think it takes that kind of decision making and that kind of strong leadership to find success, especially in something so incredibly devastating throughout the entire land.
I really like what you mentioned there, relating this story to our modern day apostles and prophets and the way that they guide the church. And I think that's a very applicable parallel to this story. Along with that, I can't help but think about, because of my background, especially my education, where I got my master's degree in international relations. And we talk about similar things that were illustrated in this story of Joseph, especially when it comes to laying up stores during times of plenty to help cover the times of famine. And that's a power play. And Joseph, through his wisdom, literally saved Egypt and those surrounding countries. And and I think on some level, at some point in that period of time, the people realized that he literally saved them. Because it sounds like that famine, 7 years of famine where there's no food, would be enough to wipe out whole populations. And we've seen times in the world's history where that type of thing has happened. So how can we pull things out of that story to apply to ourselves? Well, I think there's a lot of application there, especially when it comes to uh, the consideration that back to our modern day prophets who have counseled us as members to do what we can to prepare for difficult times, and that recognizing there are some places in the world that it's against the law to store stuff in your house and to have big storage areas. But in times where you can, that's a good idea to do that. And along with that, and I think sometimes we forget this principle, but along with that, we need to lay up stores of spiritual wisdom and understanding so that when those difficult times come, we will have those spiritual stores, so to speak, to rely on to help us get through those difficulties.
Absolutely. And it takes constant stocking up, as it were. With those who are familiar with like a year's supply of food or just food storage in general, the best thing to do is to rotate through that, right? To have stuff that you would normally eat anyway, and that as you need it, you take it from the front and put some more in the back and just keep rotating through that. The same spiritually, as you said, keep reading the scriptures on a daily basis. Make sure that you're constantly filling that storage as you're using it, and and it will always be there for you, fresh and ready to go. It will never have sat stale or gone bad or suffered from neglect. And I think you're right. I think that's a great approach to this.
It's also interesting, too, Jason, when you think about it. You look at the story of Joseph when he's in Egypt, and you have to understand that's an interesting situation there because Joseph is a Hebrew. And obviously, he's in an interesting situation. First of all, he's in prison, and he's at the mercy of whoever's in charge. And then when he comes before Pharaoh and actually helps bolster the economy or give Pharaoh the understanding of his dreams and is given power to do whatever is needed or necessary to save that country. You think about that relationship there. You've got Pharaoh, who's the most powerful person in that part of the world, and Joseph, who's just a Hebrew boy. And you look at that relationship and realize that at some point, Pharaoh realized that this individual needs to be given some power and authority to do something great. And that's a leadership principle that perhaps we can recognize and think about. Sometimes we see individuals that have great potential, and all they need is a little nurturing and to be given some responsibility. And perhaps as if we're ever in a position to do so, we can help nurture those types of leaders, such as we saw in Joseph in that wonderful story.
Yeah. And I wonder if, you know, if Pharaoh also recognized Joseph's lineage, because it wasn't terribly long before this that Abraham came into Egypt and had a very memorable experience with the Pharaoh at that point, and then introduced the gospel among the Egyptians, including the entire endowment session. So here's Joseph, the great grandson of Abraham. Maybe there was something there that resonated with Pharaoh, that he recognized that, hey, truth and power came to us from Abraham, and here's a descendant of his. Maybe I should give him extra, an extra ear or an extra bit of attention, as it were.
That's a really good point, and it would be neat if we could see what influence there was remaining still in Egypt from Joseph's great grandfather. And we know
Yeah.
that family connections are really important in that part of the world. So that's a good point.
And Joseph at this point basically becomes Egyptian. He now spends his entire, teenage years and adulthood and everything. He's an Egyptian. He marries an Egyptian woman. His kids are Egyptian, and he's no longer Hebrew at this point. I mean, he is Egyptian, and so when he's reunited with his brothers, he's still different from them in that sense. Um, and we see this throughout the rest of the scriptures, this kind of separation, because Joseph, his two sons were Ephraim and Manasseh. Well, the writers of the Book of Mormon were of the tribe of Manasseh. Nephi and Lehi, they trace their lineage through Manasseh, and Manasseh, full on Egyptian. There was no Hebrew about him, and the brass plates that came down were handed down to the Nephites, and we're told that they had the writings of Joseph on them, in Egyptian, in Reformed Egyptian, and so the brass plates come down through the lines of Manasseh from Joseph, supposedly, and are written in Egyptian. And so the brass plates, which Nephi was commanded to kill for and to take into the wilderness with them, might very well have been Joseph's personal scriptures that he wrote in Egyptian, and that his family line continued writing on in Egyptian. And Nephi makes lots of parallels between him and Joseph, and I think that he feels a kinship there with him. We see several connections just in how people are described. Joseph was called a dreamer by his brethren. They used it as like a slang or a slur. Lehi is called a visionary man in much the same way. It's a slur. He's like, I know, I'm a visionary man. Joseph's brothers were angry that he thought to rule over them. Nephi's brethren were angry that he thought to rule over them. Joseph's brethren thought to abandon him to the wild beasts in the wilderness. Nephi's brethren thought to abandon him to wild beasts in the wilderness. Joseph was sold to Potiphar, captain of the guard. Nephi actually got the plates from Laban, who was captain of the guard. And so we see a lot of kind of quirky parallels between the two, but I think it's because Nephi felt such a kinship to Joseph that he was almost trying to tie Joseph's narrative into it to give it credence and authority, and to also show that the same authority now lies in Nephi to continue on with his narrative.
That's really a good point. And you think about the number of times, especially in the Book of Mormon, where they remind each other of the foundational story of being in Israel for all those, or in Egypt for all those
Mm-hmm.
years, and then being brought out. And it's an interesting connection there with the brass plates and Joseph. And that's certainly something that we should all do more research on and see if we can find um, as many of those parallels as we can. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And as we kind of wind up here, I want to point to another parallel that I find really interesting and one that we certainly can apply in our lives. Um, I want to talk about, we've talked about like the Abrahamic covenant, we've talked about these different kinds of covenants. I've referred to this as the Joseph covenant, and it's how to prosper. Um, so we talked about a couple of different parts of the Abrahamic covenant to do with deliverance and protection. But in this one, it's how to prosper. And the name Joseph means two different things. It means to gather or to restore, in addition to being scattered. So or to take away. So Joseph's name means to gather or restore, and we'll see how this can kind of play into like the example that we're given. Um, I'll give an explicit a definition here of the Joseph covenant in 2 Nephi 1:20. It says, "Inasmuch as ye shall keep my commandments, ye shall prosper in the land." We've heard variations of this a lot. There are 18 different instances in the Book of Mormon where we hear that same sentence in one way or another. And there's an additional 60 instances in the Book of Mormon where it describes people prospering and tells us that it's because they kept the commandments. So who were the writers of the Book of Mormon? They were descendants of Joseph in Egypt. And I think that they understood this. So Joseph relates both the Hebrew root Yasaf to add and Asaph, meaning both to take away and then to gather. And so if we look at the first meaning to add, I'm going to just say that it means to prosper, to add on to oneself, to prosper. And we in Genesis 39, we have three times where the Lord was with Joseph and Joseph prospered. So in verses 2 and 3 and then 23, we have this thing. It says, "And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. The keepers of the prison looked not on anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper." So why did Joseph prosper? And I'm going to just oversimplify it and say that it's because he kept the commandments. Time after time, when Joseph was presented with an opportunity to break the commandments, he kept them. Sleeping with Potiphar's wife would have been easy to do. She comes in, she tries to seduce him. He's a nobody. There's no one around. The easiest thing to do would have been to give in. However, he had received his temple covenants. He had received a garment of the priesthood. He had made covenants, and it was his intent to keep them. Often, in order to prove in court if somebody's committed a crime, if you're lacking a witness or any kind of evidence like that, you have to prove three things: intent, opportunity, and means. Joseph had opportunity and means to break his covenants and to be with Potiphar's wife, but his intent was to keep the commandments of God. It showed in his character. Joseph was trusted not just by the Lord, but by Potiphar, by the jailer, by Pharaoh, and it's always because Joseph was so strict in keeping the commandments. He was incredibly faithful. He was exactly faithful. And because he would kept the commandments, he prospered in the land. He goes from being a nobody in a prison to being the second in command of all of Egypt. He prospered not only himself, but he prospered Egypt under him. Just like everything he did in the jail or in Potiphar's house, everything he touched turned to gold. Everything that he was in charge of worked and worked well and prospered. And it's because the Lord was with them. And so the Book of Mormon comes to us through the descendants of Joseph, and they understand that if you keep the commandments, you will prosper. And that's something that we can pull from today. We can make this covenant. We can keep our covenants. We can keep the commandments exactly. It can be our intent to always be faithful, and we will prosper. It may not be because with money. It may not be with whatever we're hoping for in the moment. We might be trying to figure out how we're going to balance the checkbook, and we're saying, man, we've been faithful. It sure would be nice to have an abundance of gold or bread or whatever. But the prosperity will come, and it will be noticeable, and it will be recognizable, and it will be attributed directly to our keeping the commandments.
Thanks for listening to Truth and Soberness, declaring the word through Come Follow Me. This show was produced by Voice Right Media. Any reproductions or copying of any content of this show are strictly prohibited without the written consent of the owners.